Okay, so now we're going to continue with part two of our lecture, our video lecture on culture and adolescent psychology. So let's start with just a quick roadmap. We're going to look at in this one more closely at two general topics within the topic of culture, which is how are ethnicity and socioeconomic status, what are they, and how do they influence adolescents in particular. Now, some of this is relatively straightforward and intuitive. I don't think that I'm just mostly reviewing what probably fits some people's ideas. Like if I told someone was low socioeconomic status, you might conclude that poverty and lack of income and lack of resources is going to be a big part of who they become. But some of them may be a little bit more subtle, and we'll talk about that as well. What role does ethnicity play in adolescent life? Which means that really critically as an adolescent, because family and identity are critical issues that are coming together during this period of time. Part of an extension of that is who you are in terms of ethnicity. You may either decide to embrace an ethnicity, or you might decide to reject it, or you might decide to, in a sense, stretch the meaning of the ethnic group. And lastly, how does socioeconomic status influence adolescent psychology? So not only what it is, but how does it influence adolescent psychology? So let's socioeconomic status, and the key word here is that there's two words, socio and economic. It isn't simply about how much wealth or income that your family has. There are some things where someone might be poor in terms of income, but might be relatively high in socioeconomic status because they have strength or power in some other area of social life. So, for example, occupations that vary in prestige. So, a lot of manual workers actually make a lot of money. So you can be very well paid as working in a hair salon. You can be very well paid as a plumber or working in a building trade. Probably more than a lot of white collar jobs. But they don't. But they're generally considered low prestige and not really desirable. One good example of this is that I worked at BOCES, and we had a plumbing program, and there's a lot of demand for plumbers. And eventually that program got cut, not because there weren't jobs available for people who want to go in that profession, but that too few students saw that as a desirable job to go into. People didn't want to become plumbers. While people are more, even despite the fact that the pay is relatively high, if you look at it in terms of, let's say, what they make in a year compared to an average white collar job. But the thing about it is that white collar jobs, even when they pay less, are given more prestige, more deference, and more social status. And you might say that access to these higher status occupations are generally governed by completion of a college degree. And if you're not able to complete a college degree, you're basically shut out of these higher prestige jobs. So it's not necessarily directly connected, although often it is, to the level of income. Different levels of education. There are a lot of poor graduate students, and there's a lot of poor adjunct professors who are not making a lot of money. And also just on top of like how much they're making, but the stability of their income. With different levels of education, there's more and better access to education in some areas than others. So for example, there are graduate students who don't make a lot of money, but they have a lot of education. And generally they are seen as being higher socioeconomic status. They're more likely to assert their rights or their interest in someone with lower socioeconomic status, even though their income is less. Now, the obvious part is that the economic part is that you might have different levels of economic resources. And not just in terms of how much money you make, but how flexible your job is. So, for example, if you work for a wage, if you are not working, you're not earning. And you see this very often during the quarantine and the coronavirus situation where people who are receiving salaries are generally having the resources to continue and self-quarantine and isolate and shelter in place and maintain social distance. While people in service professions or service occupations are generally paid wages, which means including nurses. If they don't work, they're not going to get paid. And I'm a volunteer EMS, and I can tell you that there's a lot of people in EMS, and they're very stressed right now. And one thing that they're saying is, geez, I wish that I was wealthy because, I wouldn't have to work. And they're putting themselves into a lot of dangerous situations. But because if they don't work a shift, they're not getting paid. There's a different level of economic resources there. And in addition to just income, how much you earn, there's an issue about wealth, which means if your family has accumulated wealth over time, meaning that you own your own house, or if you have a family business, even if you're not making a lot of money on that business, the fact that you have that asset and you can draw upon that asset puts you in a better situation than most. And lastly, there's different levels of political power. in community institutions. And this is not always obvious. And one interesting study that a student did when I used to teach in college was comparing the expansion of airports in the Boston area. So Logan is in a working class area of Boston. It's relatively poor. And the other airport is in Lexington, Massachusetts, one of the richer suburban communities. And if you just think in terms of high socioeconomic status, in terms of income and wealth and things of that sort, you would think that what they were trying to do was put more flights into the Boston area, and they were deciding which airport they were going to put those extra flights into. And so you would think that the extra flights would go into Logan because, well, they would have less ability to push against it or fight the expansion of their airport flights. But in turn, it actually turned out that because they were more organized, there was a little bit of a political machine in East Boston where Logan Airport is located. They were able to stop the expansion of flights, and those flights were moved into an airport that was right next to a very wealthy suburb. So the point is that power in community institutions is generally the power of organization, and this doesn't always track, let's say, wealth and income. Some other examples of community institutions. So very often in the African American community in the United States, their religious organizations are very powerful and give them a connection and more, let's say, political power than they would if you were just looking in terms of the income and the wealth of the individuals in those groups. So there are different levels of socioeconomic status. So, we can talk about low socioeconomic status. Generally, this means low income. It generally means manual labor, working class, jobs that people describe as blue-collar jobs. So manual labor is people who are on welfare, but maybe not, let's say, poor, that they're receiving some type of support, but not complete support. And the term I think is usually the working poor. People who work in maintenance and people who have to work with their hands, handymen, things of that sort. And then you have maybe a middle socioeconomic status where it's more managerial, supervisors. Even if you're a supervisor or a manager at, let's say, a fast food store or a retail store, you come with a little more prestige than you would if, let's say, you are not a manager at maybe a higher paying job. White collar jobs, so anything that usually works in an office, cubicle, a lot of you might say, white collar service jobs would fall into these things. Occupations include salesmen for businesses, managers, professions like doctors, lawyers, teachers, accountants. Even when they're not making that much money, they generally are accorded more status because there's a notion that they hold some type of prestige or they don't have to do quote unquote dirty work. And lastly, you might think of a wealthy group, and there was a case a few years ago about affluenza, and the idea that children who are raised in a wealthy environment don't learn responsibility. And there was a legal case where a person who was driving their car recklessly and killed several people was acquitted because the defense lawyer argued for something called affluenza, which means growing up in an affluent environment, there were no limits, there were no boundaries, there were no rules, and as a result, they didn't take responsibility for their actions, and that wasn't their fault. It was because of the environment they were raised in. If you're rolling your eyes, I might share that reaction that, like, this is really not an affliction, but we can think that being wealthy also confers sometimes to psychology or ways of thinking of themselves. And there are socioeconomic variations, and it's not just individuals, meaning an individual adolescent. It can be the whole neighborhood. It could be the family structure you find in different subcultures, and it could be even the schools that you find in different parts of even Westchester, where some schools are, I would say, very blue collar in their orientation, and other schools are very, let's say, elitist in their orientation, even though they're both public schools. So, poverty. So the federal poverty threshold is generally cost of food, and you multiply that by 3, which means whatever cost to feed for the food for the family unit, times that by 3 for your other costs. That is where the poverty threshold is generally set. This is adjusted for family size, so if you have a larger family, you might be making more money, but you might be closer to the poverty line because there's more mouths to feed and there's more costs involved with that. And also inflation, which means that every single year they update this for the rising cost of goods and services, including particularly food. And one thing that often happens at the federal level is how we define inflation can define like who qualifies and doesn't qualify for poverty. And so there's a lot of different ways where they're indexing for inflation that would in effect cast many people off receiving social support, even though I think the clear impression, if you knew their family stories, is that they're poor. So in the 1990s, it was at roughly around 17% below the poverty line. You can see here in the lower left-hand corner several different measures of poverty and what percentage of people were at different levels. So in the late 1960s, you had Lyndon Johnson, LBJ's war on poverty, and that brought down the poverty rate from the mid-20s down to the teens. And in the 1970s, this might have been in the low teens, and since 1980, this has been hovering right around 15%. There are some new ways of measuring poverty, and that are probably better attuned or better calibrated, that suggest that poverty might be a little bit higher or a little bit lower. But the key thing here is that poverty has become increasingly something that happens to children. If you want to look before World War II, the modal person in poverty was an elderly person who couldn't work anymore, and because Social Security and other types of supports for elderly people didn't exist, most people who were poor were elderly. But if you look at, it's only about 15–20% for the population as a whole. The percentage of children in poverty is about 10% higher, which means if it's it's up in the 20% even to this day. And if you look at the people who are within 50% of the poverty line, which 200% of the poverty line, which means they have double the poverty level of poverty, which is still something that would be poor, particularly would be poor in Westchester County, where you guys are students. It's almost 40, 45, 50% of the population or of children that are near the poverty line, which means even though they don't meet, let's say, the technical definition of poverty, they're not much above it. Part of this is because of what you might call the feminization of poverty. Far more women than men live in poverty, even though there's about 50% in the population as a whole. Women tend to have low income because they earn less than men when they're entering the private workforce. The effects of divorce means it cuts them off from one type of support, not just because they might not get the income from their spouse, but also because there's a division of assets. So when you sell a home under divorce conditions, you might not make as much money back, or the asset is worth more in use than it is for what you can sell it and turn it into money. You don't have a lot of shared costs. When you split homes, you have to buy two of a lot of different things, and that raises cost. And very often the resolution of the divorce might mean that women are not getting enough support, given the consideration that they have to raise the children very often because they get custody of the children, that effectively that drives them below the poverty line. And that's assuming that the support is actually paid. And this leaves women with less money than they and their children actually need. And very often what you see is that women, female-headed households, meaning a household with one parent and a female parent, is more likely to fall below the poverty line than other types of family units. So some causes of poverty, and child poverty in the United States is the highest in the developed world. Malnutrition and hunger is the highest in the developed world. And we think of the United States as a wealthy country, and it is in terms of our aggregate wealth, but very often what we see is that our children in this country do more poorly than, let's say, countries that we often would compare the United States to, meaning Western Europe, Canada, Japan, and other countries of that sort. So what are the reasons for this? One is there was an elimination of well-paying blue-collar jobs. So the jobs that people could get without a college education, a lot of these jobs were, and I don't want to get into the cause of this because I think these reflect the biases of the analysts, but some things that are often cited for the disappearance is outsourcing of jobs, manual labor to overseas. I think what you've seen is the automation of jobs, meaning some jobs replaced by robots or by computers that would have been done by hand in the past. And then lastly, the decline of unions, which means that unions often pushed manual labor jobs into higher pay scales, and as a result, people could support themselves on that. And as unions have become weaker since the 1970s, what you've seen is not just in terms of pay and income, but also in terms of benefits have declined over time for a lot of people who have been blue-collar union job households. The other thing that's happened is an increase in single-parent families, but on top of that, as I said before, female-headed households. So if you look at these charts here by family status, the female household is by far more likely to be below the poverty line than other types of households. So if you compare, for example, the female household versus the male household, there's a difference of almost 30% between the level of poverty in those households, and even lower than that, married couples. So it's not simply a matter of, it's whether a divorced household, it's really whether who's heading that household. The female half of the divorced household is doing a lot worse than the male half of that household. Another thing here is that if you see poverty by age, you can see that under 18 years, which is kind of the age we're talking about, it went up in the 1970s in the same way that let's say, poverty for people who are 65 years and older, and you can see in the late 60s that it was 30%, it drops down to about 10%, even below 10% recently, while at the same time, poverty for people under the age of 18 was around 15%, and now it's roughly in the 20-25%. So that has gone up. And kind of parallel what poverty is in for the middle, 18 to 64, the working age population. And the last aspect of this is a reduction in social programs. Starting really, really under Reagan, but if you want to look at it, Nixon and Carter also were scaling back some programs even before Reagan became president. But you've seen a reduction of social programs in both their generosity and who qualifies for them, and adding different requirements and reducing some of the benefits that are not necessarily income related, but like things like food stamps, where even in the midst of the coronavirus crisis, people are being kicked off food stamps because of changes in eligibility requirements. What you're also seeing is, reductions by block granting Medicaid, that a lot less people are going to have the social supports that kind of, even though their income was below the poverty line, losing these programs or these benefits is pushed. If they were above the poverty line with these benefits, they're below the poverty line when they're taken away. So, not surprisingly, it's not just simply a lack of money. It also means that when you're poor, very often you're in environments that are not conducive to development and health. It means you might be more exposed to poor health conditions, which means there might be toxins in your environment. There might be lead paint in your apartment. You're more likely to be subject to homelessness, environmental toxins in your environment, so people buried chemical waste in the ground. And not surprisingly, a lot of these are in old settlements that have moved from becoming places that were densely populated and wealthier in the past to becoming places where people who can't afford to live, move out to the suburbs because for a lot of different reasons. They can't afford a car, they need to walk to their environment, they can't afford to buy a house, so they tend to be in rental units. All this leads to a lot more instability. And on top of that, one thing that might not seem related is that if you're in a community where most of the housing units are apartments, what it means is that you're going to get a lot of turnover in who lives there. And this can affect something like the school, because when you have different people living there as different renters come through the city or the town, what happens is you can't keep the school district as accountable because there's not like a certain group of people who have a lot of experience with the school district and know how to press the buttons and get the school to respond to their needs. And you see this, and this leads to a decrease in the quality and the responsiveness of schools, even if the schools are relatively wealthy. And so the point is that what poverty does is that it creates a lot of other dynamics that lead to poor conditions, whether it can be level of crime in the neighborhood, violence, it could be levels of quality of schools and whether they're being held accountable, and a variety of other things. And one thing, it might be a lower generosity of social programs, and also people in your community that have knowledge about how to hook up to these resources and these institutions that are maybe more established in places where there's higher levels of home ownership, which generally is not something that happens when there's a high level of poverty. So I'm going to read a few quotations by adolescents who live in poor situations and how they react to it. And while a lot of this speaks for themselves, I'm going to read it and maybe give some commentary on it. So let me just read the first quotation. Kids remain there, not physically, but with their words. Who does your shopping for you? You've never been to the Calhoun Club? Where do you get your clothes from? You mean you haven't been out of the United States? You rent your home? You mean you don't get an allowance? I couldn't have what they had or really understand the importance of it all, and I felt it acutely. There were times when I could be talking with someone, and instead of listening to whatever it was I was saying, they'd be staring at my clothes. And I think people who are relatively poor and relative to the environment they're in, generally that becomes part of their identity because they're the one who couldn't drive their own car, who wasn't able to go on a spring break vacation. Um, Even if you're, like, say, relatively wealthy, you're not poor in any strict or even loose sense of it. But if your reference group are people that are much wealthier than you, then you're going to feel deprived, and it basically says what's wrong with me and what's wrong with my family. There's nothing wrong with renting, but and in many countries the level of rent home ownership is much lower, and the percentage of people who rent is much higher. But in the United States, renting is considered a stigma. And you see this even where people would rather, like, say, own a really poor, bad home than rent a nicer one. And someone was pointing this out today about, let's say, sometimes with trailer parks or with, broken down homes, that people would rather have ownership because even if objectively the living conditions are worse, um, if you have a sense of ownership and pride that, I can say this belongs to me and I can say what happens here and other people can't tell me what to do. And if you don't have that, you're going to experience a different situation. And as children reach adolescence, they're going to get more and more aware of this. And the point is that when they're asking that questions, it might be just like ignorance of the affluent people who says, you seem to be very different. You're kind of like a strange tribe. You pick out clothes that don't seem to be in fashion. And while that might be just like their own curiosity even, and they don't feel like they're being denigrating when they ask questions like that, the fact that you're asking those questions can make those questions are being asked of you can make you feel, let's say, inadequate or deprived. And I think what happens is that people, instead of noticing who you are, what you're actually saying, they're staring at what you don't have, i.e. maybe your clothes are not in fashion or they're hand-me-downs or things of that sort. Now the second quotation. Being poor was awful. The bills were too many and too much. It didn't help me in dealing with the daily questionings or scornful looks from my peers. When they did that, I just looked away or down, shoulders slumped, because I felt self-conscious. Um, Obviously, most adolescents and teenagers feel very self-conscious even if everything is going well. But to feel, let's say, that you don't fit in, or the fact that there's things you have to pay for, um, basically accelerates or makes that even more acute than it would be otherwise. So being poor, that paying bills, and I tutored in homes in Buffalo, New York, and I can remember dealing with parents who were crying because they were trying to do what they could for their children, and they were really good parents and they were really education centric. But I would see them like piles of bills on their desks and just feel they're feeling overwhelmed to the point where they felt ashamed. And so very often I was saying, this idea that children, parents who are in poverty with children are generally thought of being that they don't value education as much as maybe some households that are more affluent. My own experience is the opposite, which means it's more about the resources than the commitment to education. When I've worked in cities like Buffalo or Kingston, Kingston or New York City, what I often found is that parents care a lot about education. They really want to know what is it I can do for my child. And either because they don't have the background themselves to be able to do certain things, or they don't have the resources to get the extra help their children need, or even know how to negotiate with the school district to get services and programs, their children are at a disadvantage. And I've seen plenty of affluent parents who don't seem to care, who don't pressure their children to work hard and things of that sort. And it's not like that it's the opposite of what the stereotype is that it's a lot more complex. I've seen it to describe it as a culture, meaning something that attributes to the whole group of people, does not really seem to be the case. Um, Now let's move into our second topic about ethnicity, and I think the key thing we're going to emphasize here is prejudice, which is that you know generally younger children do not show prejudices or attitudes or notice differences between people as much as, let's say, middle school and high school students, meaning early and middle adolescents. And you see that they're more likely to make comments about race, ethnicity, uh, being rich and poor than they would be a few years ago. Um, you see this in elementary schools where kids basically see other kids as kids, and a kid is someone to play with, and they don't really think that they should not associate with one particular kid or another. At most, what they're going to see is kids are nice and mean, but they're not going to see skin color, they're not going to see ethnic group, they're not going to see language. In fact, they're going to see that as something interesting, that appeals to their curiosity. But as identity hardens or kind of crystallizes in your adolescent years, you're going to also see negative takes on ethnicity and identity develop, which means part of being who I am is a rejection of what other groups are. And so, what is the nature of these value conflicts? And particularly in a diverse, pluralistic society like the United States, how do different cultures and different ethnicities interact with each other? Because you can't just kind of treat the way that some countries that are more homogeneous, where they treat everyone as being a member of a larger family, meaning everyone is from the same ethnic group, so everyone is kind of related. In the United States, there's more likely to have kind of an us versus them attitude against other groups within our society, all who are clearly American. So just to give you a definition here, I mean, I'm sure all of you understand the word prejudice, but it's an unjustified and negative attitude, which means it's not based on facts, it's not based on, and I would say there are a lot of people who think that their negative attitudes are not prejudicial because they think there are some facts there and they might cite some statistics or describe an anecdote of their own experience. That doesn't make it not prejudiced. Prejudice is basically saying that the importance that you are giving a particular attitude is well beyond what the whole information would support. And so the point is that when I'm describing groups, I can say, well, in some cases there may be a kernel of truth here, or there might be an experience of a story that fits a stereotype. But the problem here is that you project that stereotype on the whole group, and you tend to have a negative view of the whole group that prejudges how someone's going to behave or the worth of an individual person. And so even if you can cite, facts and science to support your view, and you can't see me, but I'm putting this in air quotes when I'm saying this like facts, these are really not what a social scientist would accept as an accurate description of a group's behavior. That being said, that doesn't mean that there are not group characteristics that are relevant, particularly in understanding what are the influences on people as they develop. So what you often see is that these prejudices are based upon things that are visible. So things like ethnicity and race, skin color. Sometimes, although it's I think less visible today than in the past, but religion. Although I think you're seeing in the coronavirus, you're seeing, I've been reading stories recently about discrimination against Asian Americans, but also Hasidic communities in the New York City suburban area, and attributing kind of, let's say, negative things to them in terms of crises. And my own research when I was studying the Japanese police, the bias against Koreans in Japan at the time of the 1924 Tokyo earthquake, and that in the wake of the earthquake, with everyone suffering, people believed that Koreans were poisoning the wells and making people sick, and you had vigilante groups going around in Japan, literally killing Koreans resident in Japan. And to the extent where what the police had to do is they took the Koreans and they arrested them to put them in jail to keep them safe. Now, there's a longer story there, but the point about that, in a country we don't really think it's violent, in a country we think it's homogeneous, you can still see kind of these negative things, particularly in trying times like we are in today. So age could be part of it. So if someone's too old or too young, and I think there's still a lot of gender stereotypes that are inaccurate, and it's one of those things that is potentially very visible in the way that people dress, and their hair and other types of cosmetic and aesthetic details, and people can make negative judgments based on them. So I want to talk about 4 different kind of groups, and I'm going to kind of try to get. So as I've said in the previous lecture, I'm going off the curriculum from the district here, and some of these I think are kind of overgeneralizing, and I really don't endorse them personally myself. But I'm going to go over them because I think what I can use them as examples to illustrate how ethnicity might matter. And I think of it in those terms rather than, that these are accurate, complete, comprehensive descriptions of different ethnic groups and their behavior. So take them as more suggestive than anything else. There are people in this class, obviously, from every different group that I'm going to describe here, and you are more experts kind of on the cultures of these groups than anything that I'm going to say, even about the group that I would identify and belong to. So African Americans, you might see a larger proportion of poor and low socioeconomic status individuals in this group. A lot of this is because they're victims of historic and not just like discrimination 150 years ago, but ongoing discrimination that is happening today. That very often I think that people would dismiss, let's say, the lack of success sometimes that African Americans experience to well, everything was made equal back in the 1960s with Martin Luther King, and therefore any like lack of success is on them. I would say like it's very clear to me at least, and I'm old enough to kind of have a broad experience of time, that the discrimination is quite ongoing, and that there's racial attitudes that have material impacts on people and have impacts on people's success and failure. One thing is de facto geographic segregation is that you have a lot more segregation by community, which means because of redlining, because of urban versus rural differences, you're seeing that American students are much more segregated now than they were before the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s because of the decisions about where people move. I live in a place called Cornwall, New York in Orange County. It is about 90% white. Just directly north of me is New Windsor and Newburgh, New York, which are large minority communities. And it's very striking how people sort themselves out. And I worry about that because I would prefer my children grow up in a more diverse community. And some of it's dictated by just things like, well, what's the best commute? And you pick your commute. But the fact that we talked before about different occupations, where you pick your commute is based partly on where your occupation is located, which then leads to certain communities becoming more segregated. And I think there's also more cultural segregation. And I showed you the segment from the documentary Freakonomics about how even choosing names for children has become more culturally segregated. And Professor Roland Fryer at Harvard, and he's become more controversial, I think, in the last few years than after that documentary was done. But I think his research is still interesting and provocative, is that cultural segregation is a real thing. And it's accumulation of a lot of individual choices, but also an affirmation of certain identities, both by African Americans, but also by white Americans and other ethnic groups in the United States. The key thing I want to emphasize here is that most African American youth do not fit popular stereotypes. That there's a kind of a stereotype created by popular culture, and that you see here repeated, including by very intelligent people who should know better, that are kind of predicates about these different groups. They're not true. The best students I've had have been almost exclusively African American students, like across the board. Their commitment to education is greater in my experience as a teacher. And I have taught in communities where most of the students were minority students, whether New York City or Mount Vernon or Kingston. And I think what the point is that you learn that generalizations are maybe okay as a first order take on things, but if you buy too much into them, you're more likely to make the wrong conclusion than the right conclusion. What you saw in the 1980s and 1990s, although I think this is a little bit has stalled because of a lot of other things going on in our economy, is that you saw an increasingly large African American middle class, and that as some African Americans have a bit more access to things like college educations or certain occupations not being discriminatory or equal opportunity laws, you've seen at least some African Americans moving out from, let's say, working class into the middle income ranges. And this is more pronounced in certain communities than others, where a tradition of education, particularly with historically black colleges, has made a kind of a separate culture within the subculture of African Americans. Probably the best example of this, is the portrayal of the Huxtable family on The Cosby Show. That was a very popular show in the 1980s and 1990s that kind of affirmed that kind of African American middle class. What you might also see in this culture is you more likely to have extended families. There's been a lot of historical research on this about why extended families and the using of the terms brother and sister for people that are not biologically brothers and sisters among African Americans. And a lot of this had to do with the breakup of families under slavery. As Harvard professor Stephen Hahn has kind of documented in his historical research. But also I think what has happened that, like for example, there's a very good book about the community of Harlem in New York City, that many of the housing units were originally built for Italian American laborers who were coming all across as immigrants, and a lot of these buildings and these apartments were built for single male migrant workers. And so the layout of the rooms very often did not fit to support, family units or extended family units even more so. And that when the Italian Americans, which Harlem used to be an Italian American community, um, moved to different neighborhoods, what you saw is when they had the Great Migration, they moved into Harlem, and the structure of these things kind of undermined the ability to maintain family units because the housing stock was really not designed for that. It was designed for as kind of like dormitory life. And that there's a really interesting book kind of documenting how this occurred from the late 1800s into about what the period we might call the Harlem Renaissance. Um, so extended families, and I think religion is also very important, that the major social institution for many African Americans, and mainly because this is one of the few that was allowed to survive through slavery, is that the social institution is the local African church, African American church, and I think that has kind of organized them socially. And you see this much more in the South and the Southwest than you do in the North, where religion is not just some place where you go to worship God. It's kind of a core social unit that organizes things like sporting activities and organizes things like social events. And as the Great Migration, as African Americans migrated from the South to the northern cities, you saw some of these institutions follow them and have kind of still remain an important part of their social life. And as a result, the institutions that socialize adolescents into adult society. Hispanics and also Latinx. So one thing is that Hispanic was a term coined by the U.S. Census back in the 1970s. It doesn't fit really a group, and many people who might fall under this category don't necessarily identify as that. And so sometimes you hear the word Chicano or Latina, Latino, and sometimes now you see Latinx, and the X stands for Latina and Latino combined. I'm not going to get too much into the nomenclature of the vocabulary here, but just to give you some aspects of groups, they make about 17% of the total U.S. population today. And of that 17%, about 60% or 3/5 have their roots in Mexico, 10% from Puerto Rico, and about 4% from Cuba. However, this differs by region. So in the South and Southwest, meaning from Texas to California, and including the mountain states like Colorado, you're seeing most of the Hispanic community is probably Mexican or Central American in their origins, while on the East Coast, Florida, New York City, you're going to see a much larger percentage of people with Puerto Rican and Cuban backgrounds, and also from Latin America proper, meaning Venezuela, Colombia, etc. Just in a local area, you see, let's say, even though it's not a large population in terms of the Hispanic community in the country as a whole, you see a very large Ecuadorian population, you see a relatively large Guatemalan population. When I lived in Boston, there was a huge Brazilian population, so much so that the majority of some towns was Brazilian American. And you can find like the Cuban community very concentrated in southern Florida. So the point about this is that it's a different story depending where you are, and I would say that the thing with Hispanics is that it's a category with a lot of diversity inside the category. The other part too is that all socioeconomic groups are represented, and a lot of this reflects that their background. And let's give you one idea. Immigrants tend to be better educated and more entrepreneurial than people who don't immigrate, which means that when we tend to think of immigrants as like, in the Emma Lazarus and New Colossus, like, the teeming masses and things of that sort, that these are kind of like the worst off, and people are sending, let's say, the failures of their society coming to a host country. But that's actually not really true. Very often they're better educated because it takes a lot of skill to uproot yourself from one place and then be successful and set up a new life in a different culture and with a different language. What you sometimes see is very often you have interrupted educations, and you find this very often when first generation immigrants, is that they don't really belong to their original culture, and they don't really belong to the country they immigrated to as well, because they didn't learn their first language because they left during their school age years. But when you look at, let's say, the parents, very often they're highly educated, very hardworking, very dedicated, just like immigrant groups have been for generation after generation in the United States. And you can also see, for example, in Cuba, what you see is a lot of professionals and a lot of highly educated people were the ones that left, mostly because of, let's say, their opposition to the Castro regime, but also their affiliation with the previous Batista regime. And so you see, like, maybe, let's say, a more of a middle upper class among that ethnic group than you might find in, let's say, Mexican immigrants or Puerto Rican immigrants, who are coming for different reasons. My brother-in-law is a Mexican immigrant, but his father was an engineer, educated in Mexico, and he went to Whitney Cerritos High School in Southern California, which is one of the highest performing high schools in the United States. So my point about this is that there's diversity not just in terms of their ethnic origins and their ethnic cultures, but there's also diversity in terms of like their from high education to low education, and from very affluent to poverty, and you see it kind of span those large groups. What you also see among Hispanics and Latin communities that they've had more ability to kind of, in a sense, to join, you might say, white culture. And you see sometimes this among adolescents and teenagers, whether they choose kind of their distinctive ethnic culture, or they kind of, in a sense, choose to be more Anglo, or more European, or more American, and once again I put that in air quotes, as the choice of their identity. And so you might things where they either play up or play down their identity, and that's kind of a choice that comes with their identity crisis that occurs during the adolescent years. Okay, some other things about Hispanic communities, largely, at least culturally Catholic, and very family oriented. And the previous teacher of this course was Hispanic, and I think this characterizes, I think, her own feelings, that the statement that as long as our family stays together, we're strong. You have kind of clearly gender roles for parents, father having, you could say, stronger authority, and that authority is to be obeyed without question. We talked about different parenting styles previously, and so you find them more authoritarian than authoritative among Latin families and cultures. But however, you don't see the same negative impacts as when these parenting types are found in white cultures. You see the mother being more revered, and particularly a source of affection, and kind of almost sometimes in this, it's called Marianismo, and kind of the association with your mother with the Virgin Mary Catholicism is kind of, let's say, a warm, tender, caring source of authority that is nurturing, and that you see this common. Although I think you find this also in Mediterranean families, meaning Italian, Greek, and Jewish families as well, where the mother has kind of a dominant role in the home, in a way that belies kind of the fact that these cultures are not always, let's say, the most progressive, or in terms of, let's say, the status of women. Once said this before, but large and extended families are kind of common, and this has to do with, I think, the largest support group that is both common among immigrant populations that are recently immigrants, and also that kind of consistent with Catholic culture in general. Asian Americans, fastest growing group of American adolescent population. In some ways, you see a lot of parallels with Latin cultures, and then some clear distinctions. Family is always important. There is a tendency to remain separate subcultures, which means you can see groceries and businesses that kind of target to their subculture, restaurants, things of that sort. One thing that's always been emphasized is a high, high expectation and the importance of education, and particularly like the parents sacrificing for their next generation. And I see this both about East Asians, but also South Asians as well, as being quite common in terms of the expectations. I think part of this, and this is just kind of an ungrounded thing, is that once again it has to do with partially like you don't get a full spectrum of people among immigrants, a full spectrum of their home societies. What you tend to get is that I find that a lot of the people who from South Asia who migrated to the United States, and also who migrated throughout the territories of the British Empire, is you tend to find higher upper caste individuals making up a lot of people who have, either Brahmin backgrounds, and also Kshatriya backgrounds, which means they're more highly educated than their home society as a whole. Um, and as a result, the emphasis on education might reflect the kind of kind of a generalization about the caste that their families come from, and that so the point is that you're not getting the average of the home society. You're getting maybe, let's say, a truncated part of that culture. Um, and the other thing to say about East Asians, particularly in America, is that it's very geographically concentrated. There are states in this country, like Hawaii, where Japanese is spoke. Most of the population is Japanese, or Japanese American. That the Japanese culture there is quite well preserved. And I know this from studying Japan and just going to Hawaii and seeing bilingual signs, but the bilingual signs are English and Japanese, not English and Spanish. And particularly in California, and that these are communities that have been in existence now 150 to 150, 170 years. And I didn't say this before, but I should say this as well, that in the Southwest of the United States, many Hispanic communities are not immigrant communities. They are communities that lived in this geographical territory before it was part of the United States of America. In many ways, like this is their home, and sometimes the idea that white America is the original America is not actually accurate. And so some of these are very established communities in certain regions of the country, but in other regions where you might see them as newcomers, in the sense that their migration within the country has made them, you could say, show up more than you would have maybe seen 10, 20 years ago. So I want to talk about one other thing about Asian Americans, and this is kind of what I might call the good immigrant stereotype. Very often Asians are treated as if like they're well behaved, they're law abiding, they're hardworking, they work really hard in school, they're all really bright, they're all really good at math. And what I find is that, like in any stereotype, it doesn't apply to everyone in the group. And many Asian American teenagers feel a lot of pressure because they're supposed to be like this Asian stereotype, and it doesn't really describe them, because not everyone is a good student, not everyone is well behaved and deferent to authority, but they tend to get lumped into that, and some of them rebel against that. And Mindy Kaling has written about this, the actress from The Office, and a few Simon Hodge has talked about this, that how that certain Asian communities, how they're stereotyped by American culture in general, doesn't really capture the totality of what they are. I think the other thing that many Asian American groups is that, particularly East Asian, is that the assumption that everyone is Chinese, like Japanese are Chinese, Korean are Chinese, Taiwanese are Chinese, Singapore, Malaysians are Chinese. And the fact is that Americans don't know enough about Asia to understand the differences among culture. And as a result, they kind of all lump them into one category. And this reflects the ignorance of I think, Americans more than, but I think the point is it's irksome to individuals in this group, where it's presumed that all Asian groups like each other, or all of them share one culture. And anyone who has even a passing knowledge of Asia knows that this is not true. And sometimes there's animosities, and sometimes there are tensions between groups that Americans sometimes lump into the same group. Last group, Native Americans. There's about 100,000 Native American adolescents. It's an interesting story because of the reservation model and also the assimilation model that was very common until about 50, 60 years ago. And so what often happened is they were put into boarding schools, which means they were taken out of their home culture, and these schools that were trying to Americanize them or assimilate them to white culture. And so a lot of people have studied the effect of culture on adolescents in Native American communities because there was such an obvious attempt to change their culture. Many of the rest of them are in public schools on or near Indian reservations. Maybe there's kind of reservations are different for different parts of the country. We have reservations in New York State. We have reservations in the Southwest. Reservations on the Plains states, and I think some of them are really, really poor. And kind of the assumption that people in the Northeast, that Indian reservations are places where cheap gas and casinos and things of that sort, and they're taking advantage of having kind of a two-tiered legal system that applies to them as a separate nation within our country. and that some of the poorest areas in the country are on Indian reservations where you have high levels of dysfunction, meaning um, they don't have the opportunities for employment. They have a lot of minimal support, but it's not really well provided for, and this leads to things like high levels of alcoholism, um, but low standards of living, high teen pregnancy, high suicide, high school dropout rates, but not in what people sometimes expect these to occur in urban environments. And so I think this is a really good way to understand the impact of culture, because these are kind of cultures that are interacting with American culture, but kind of in some ways separate in the sense that their presence has been concentrated onto reservations, and therefore they've been able to preserve their traditional culture in a way that other groups who migrated in and then kind of dispersed through the general population have not done as much. So the last thing I want to talk about is the research of Harvard professor Roland Fryer, who's an economist at Harvard University. Did a lot of research, and he looked at one study, and there's been a lot of criticism of the study, and I'm just putting it out there as like food for thought rather than like this is the way things are, is the interaction of popularity and academic success among teenagers and how it varies among ethnic groups. So if you look on the graph on the lower left-hand corner, you see three lines, one for blacks, one for whites, one for Hispanics. So for whites, and what you see on the axis is that a measure of popularity on the y-axis and a measure of academic success, grade point average, on the x-axis. So as whites do better in school, in general, you see their popularity go up, which means you see a direct relationship that the brighter you are, the more likely you are to be popular with your peers. What you see with both Hispanics and blacks, although it's a little bit different for different groups, is that as they do better in school, they become less popular, which means that they're kind of there's a social stigma attached that if you are doing well in school, you are not showing affiliation with your ethnic group, that you're acting white in the terms of Roland Fryer. Now, acting white, I think, is his term, but what you see on the lower right-hand side is kind of, let's say, if African American is doing better in school, it's like they're rejecting their home culture and trying to assimilate to a foreign culture, a white American culture, and as a result, they suffer a popularity hit among their same ethnic group peers. And so this is actually an annotated graph from the original study. So you see the precision of, let's say, the numbers on the y-axis is from the actual academic paper, but someone just trying to describe what these areas and what these lines mean. So it's a way of thinking about like ethnic groups in terms of prejudice, but also kind of how individuals in your own group react to you, that if you make certain choices, that you have a penalty. The second thing that's not pictured here, but that Roland Fryer in the same study, is that if you put Hispanics and blacks into private schools, which means schools that are already selective or where they're isolated, their peers are different, their mix of peers is different, there's no popularity, let's say, penalty for doing better in school. And what that suggests is that African Americans who are in private schools or charter schools or selective schools will do better because there's kind of a selection of the community of peers, and we'll talk more about that in the next unit, than they in terms of, let's say, a penalty for their academic success, a social penalty for their academic success. So that's where we're going to end today. We will have a video next week, and we're going to start our next unit, which will be on peers in adolescent psychology. That's all for now, and I'll see you soon.